Well, hey everyone, welcome to Church Online. If we haven't met, my name is Brian. I'm the lead pastor over at Willamette in West Lynn. But this is a message for everyone and for all of our campuses. So wherever you are, wherever you're watching from, I'm glad that you're joining us as we begin a brand new 4-week series that we're calling Entrusted. And so for the month of November, during these 4 weeks, we're going to take a look at what it means to take ownership and responsibility. And we're asking the question, what does it mean to take ownership and responsibility to do our part with the life and the resources that we've been given? We're going to look at how everything we have has been entrusted to us by God, and we are accountable to God for how and for who we leverage it. This is the idea of everything that we have has been given to us by God, and that includes all of who we are and all of what has been entrusted to us, including our money and our resources. But oftentimes when it comes to faith, it can be so easy for us to compartmentalize, right? Kind of have our heart and then our money. And we may not say this out loud, but we think to ourselves, God, you can have my heart, but I'm going to stay in control of my money. I'll put my faith in you. I'll pray to you. I'll follow you. That's kind of our faith life. And then we compartmentalize and we say, but then I kind of have my finance life or my personal life that we still want to control. But friends, this series helps us understand that Jesus came to set the record straight. He had a different picture for us because Jesus would tell us where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He would tell his followers, you can't serve both God and money. It's connected together. And this is a problem because all we have to do is look at kids fighting over a toy, fighting over mine. All we have to do is look at kids to know that deep inside of us, there is a battle. There's a battle for us to hold on to what we feel is ours. So let's go back to the statement here. Everything we have has been entrusted to us by God, and we are accountable to God for how and for who we leverage it. So throughout this series, we're going to dive into what it means to be entrusted, to live this out well. And we will talk specifically about generosity with finances and to get the heart of God for this issue. We'll have some tangible ways to practice generosity, and we will be challenged to think about money the way God calls us to think about money, the way He's entrusted it to us. And can I just tell you that I'm personally fired up for this series. As a follower of Jesus, I want to get this right. I want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. And I want this for you too. And I believe that deep down, we all want to get this right. But I know that it's complicated. Most of us want to be generous with what God has given us, but there are questions that we have to wrestle with. Questions like this: what do we do with generosity when the cost of living is skyrocketing and the stock market is plummeting, right? Like, we want to be generous, but what do we do? Inflation, mortgage rates, rent, gas, groceries are all skyrocketing. What do we do when these are our realities? And even beyond those things, there's just kind of like life as a parent. For so many of us with our kids, we've got sports and clubs and camps, and there's always something to put money into. Some parents are weighing the cost of private school, and other parents can't even begin to think about private school because it's more than their rent or their mortgage. It's a reality. At the end of the day, all of us are asking this: what do we do with generosity when most of us wish we had a little bit more, and some of us would say we need a lot more? Everybody wants to be generous. Everyone loves generous people, but it can be hard to be one. We have this idea, and maybe even love this idea of like open-handed giving, open-handed living, being generous with what we have. But for most of us, we find our open hands becoming closed fists, holding on to what we have. On one hand, you could say we have a closed fist of scarcity. Scarcity is this closed fist that says, I need more. Maybe you have a closed fist of scarcity. You're like, I need more. God didn't entrust me with enough to be generous. I need more. Retirement is coming, right? College is looming. Credit card balance is rocketing. I need more. Scarcity closes our open hands of generosity. And then on the other hand, we battle with the closed fist of greed. If scarcity says, I need more, greed closes our fist and says, I want more. And here we have two closed fists when on the inside, we want to be generous. On the outside, this is where we find ourselves. Greed says, I want more. Let's be honest. Who doesn't want to buy, upgrade, or remodel something, right? A new car, sure. A house, I love it. Remodel the kitchen, great. A new iPhone, sure. In fact, I just saw the new iPhones. They're like square on your ear and they're like really flat, look really great. And I looked them up because I want them. It's $550. And I was like, oh my goodness. But I'm not lying, or I'd be lying if I didn't say I didn't want them. And it's hard to get things if we're giving money away. Or we can make it sound less selfish and say, it's not that I want more, it's that I want more for my family. And we begin to hold on to things because we want things for our family. Either way, our wants and desires, they cause us to hold on to what we have. And this is normal. I'm here to tell you, friends, if you're wrestling with this is absolutely normal. And it certainly isn't wrong to buy or upgrade things. If that were true, I should not be allowed to speak on this message. Wanting and needing things isn't wrong. It's just that Jesus has something to say about our heart, our priorities, and what we put our trust in. In fact, Jesus has a lot to say about it. The shocker for most people is that Jesus talked a lot about money. In fact, Jesus said more about money than heaven. This might shock you. In fact, when you read the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he gave 35 to 38, depending on how you count them, parables or stories or illustrations about what God's plans and purposes for people are. And many of these parables would start out with something like this. The kingdom of heaven is like, and then he'd tell a parable. He'd tell a story. But when he says the kingdom of heaven, many of us think of heaven as like up there. But when he talked about the kingdom of heaven is like, he wasn't talking about God's kingdom being established up there. He was talking about God's kingdom being established here, in the here and now, and the life that we're being invited into now. And in those 30 plus parables, 16 of them had to do with money and possessions, what we did with what we have here and now for the kingdom of heaven to come to earth, to be flourishing the way God intended it. And it wasn't just his parables. He would also clarify for people real life situations when it came to their money or their desire for money. So today we're going to look at one of those situations, look to what Jesus had to say, and then we'll settle in on a command that the Apostle Paul gave the early church as an example for us to follow. But let's start with Jesus dealing with everyday life. And the story begins in Luke chapter 12, and we're going to be looking at the verses of 13 through 21. But for context, I want to start with verses 6 and 7. And Jesus is teaching some really intense stuff about persecution, judgment, the heart of God. So big time stuff. And he says this in verse 6. He says, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Okay, so Jesus is talking about this. And just to be super clear with you, this had nothing to do with money, had nothing to do with finances or money. It had to do with how God values us, sees us, and cares for us. But it's almost as if this next person in the story, this person in the crowd, heard the words like sold and pennies and worth and tried to change the subject off of God's thoughts for us to what mattered most for him. Look at what happens in verse 13. It says this, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.'" So remember, Jesus is talking about God's heart for us, big time topics like persecution and judgment. And this person shouts out in the crowd, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Here's a man largely ignoring everything that Jesus is teaching about and is just interested in his problem being fixed. His fists are closed, if you will, from either scarcity or greed, worried about his worldly wealth, and he wants Jesus to fix it. And I can just imagine Jesus thinking, okay, guy, like you are totally off topic about what I'm talking about right now, but if you want to open this door, I'll walk through it, because look at what happens next. Jesus replied, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Now, none of us know the actual tone of voice Jesus had, but if I were Jesus in this situation, I wouldn't just say, man, I would be like, man, as in like, come on, man. Did you hear anything that I just said to you? Jesus saying, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? In other words, he's saying, I'm not here to make sure you get yours. In other words, he's saying, my highest priority is not fixing your financial issues so that you can get more. In fact, in another text, people had Jesus asking about taxes and this corrupt government and like, what should we do about Caesar? And Jesus basically goes, yeah, pay him, pay the taxes. Jesus doesn't even address the corrupt government. And it's not that it didn't matter. It's just that so often people would rather focus on getting more for themselves, and Jesus wasn't having it. That's not why he came, and that's not what he prioritized. And Jesus understands this about our hearts. And so he uses this situation with a man wanting his inheritance to issue a warning to both that man in the crowd, to the whole crowd, and even to us. And this is what he says in verse 15. He says, then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions. So this guy wants his inheritance. He says, Jesus, hook me up here. Have my brother give me what's mine. And Jesus says, watch out. Let's just slow down for a minute, because Jesus was issuing a warning. He's basically saying, hey, everybody, make sure this isn't white noise to your religious brains. This is a big deal. Pay attention. Then he says this, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. We need to realize that greed comes in all different forms, all different shapes and sizes. Most of us would say we're not greedy. No one thinks that they're greedy, but Jesus is saying, be aware. Greed comes in all different ways. This man that wanted his inheritance, it sounds like a legitimate concern. Like he is owed his part of the inheritance. That's not bad, right? And Jesus is like, that's not the issue. The issue is that it has something to do with your heart. And friends, we have to be aware when we're allowing legitimate concerns in our life to be a mask for issues that are deeper in our heart. Jesus knew this man's heart. Even though he had a legitimate need, he knew that there were all kinds of greed that needed to be addressed, and he addressed it. And he reminds this man, life does not consist in abundance of possessions. He says, hey, this is not what life is about. This is not what the kingdom of heaven is about. This is not what I'm inviting you into. I have something better for you. And then he unpacks that statement in verse 16 with one of these parables, one of these illustrations. And it says this, and he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is so important for us to understand that Jesus was telling us a story, and this man was saying, whatever is given to me must be for me. There was an assumption that what was given to him was for him. This man was saying in this parable, this example that Jesus was giving, he's saying, it's my harvest. These are my barns. These are my crops. It came to me, therefore it's for me. In other words, this man in this parable that Jesus is using as an illustration, he's saying, this guy thought it was all for him, and he was the owner, and he could decide what he wanted to do with it. In other words, he was the king of his castle. He was the owner of the fields. He was the boss, and he needed no input from others or from God on what he should do with this money. Remember, the parable says he thought to himself. He just looked at himself for the answers. Now remember, Jesus is talking to a guy worried about getting his inheritance because there's a desire in his heart to get more so that he could have more, right? And Jesus is painting this parable, this story, to show him that there's a better way. And he finishes in verse 21 saying this, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." And Jesus says to this guy, you are so focused on getting more for yourself that you are ignoring what it means to be rich toward God. This example in Luke 12, this parable that Jesus uses, this is just one of the many examples where Jesus cares way more about what people do with their money and their heart, because he cares and knows that our money is connected to our hearts, and he cares what our money is for. So that begs a question to be asked. How do we live a life that is rich towards God? What does it mean for you and I to live this life out, to go, okay, I don't want to just be holding on. I want to be rich towards God. What does it mean to be rich towards God? And the good news is that God doesn't leave us hanging. We see clear instruction all throughout the scriptures that God gives us about what it means to be rich towards God. So to wrap up this message today, we're going to look at one example that can give us a framework to be good stewards of the life he has entrusted to us. And we're going to look at an example from the Apostle Paul, who wrote a letter to his apprentice, Timothy. If you don't know, Paul had started all these churches all throughout Macedonia, and he had this church in Ephesus that he had started and he had left, and he sent Timothy back to Ephesus to continue the work. And the church of Ephesus kind of got sidetracked. They got sideways in their theology. They got sideways in the way that they were living, including how they viewed their possessions. And so in his letter to Timothy, Paul issues this letter, and he says this in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17. He tells Timothy, command. We're just going to stop right here because Paul starts off with some heat. He's telling Timothy in his letter, he's not saying encourage. He's not saying, hey, I suggest. No, he says command. This is a big deal. Look at what he says, command. He says, command those who are rich in this present world. So he says, hey, I have a command for you, not a suggestion, not an invitation. I have a command for those who are rich in this world. Now, you might read that and go, oh, sweet, I'm off the hook because I am not rich. This is for somebody else. But rich in the first century meant something different than what rich means for us today. Rich in the present situation in the first century, it basically simply meant anybody who had any sort of extra. That is what rich meant. In other words, extra for anything that was beyond a survival basis. If you had anything beyond food, shelter, and clothing, anything to get you past survival, it meant that you were rich, which means for those of us living in the United States that have welfare and minimum wage and ways of getting income, almost every single person would qualify in this country, in this day and age, as rich back in the first century. See, the reality, kind of the joke, not joke about rich is this. Nobody is rich, but everybody knows someone who is, right? Like, I'm not rich, and I bet if you're listening right now, you're like, I'm not rich, but each of us could tell about someone who is rich, right? Maybe we would point to a professional athlete. Or like, I'm not rich. Professional athletes, they're rich. But if you talk to professional athletes, do you know what? So many of them say they're like, we're not rich. The owners are rich. The owners have all the money. They're rich. And if you talk to the owners of professional sports, they would say, we're not rich. Let me take you to Dubai. I will show you someone with oil. I will show you what rich is really like, right? And so nobody's rich. Everybody knows someone who is. And Paul's going, no. If you have any sort of extra at all beyond survival, you have been given something to be entrusted. It has been entrusted to you, and God has a plan for you. So let's go back to our verse. He says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. Paul is saying you've been entrusted not to be arrogant. This word arrogant here, it kind of means high-minded, or I'm above the rest, or I'm dismissive. So he's saying, if you have any extra, don't be dismissive of this command. You don't get to go, you know what, this isn't for me, this is for someone else. He's saying, don't be arrogant, nor put their hope in wealth. Paul is saying, hey, whether it's I want more or I need more, if I just had more, I would be okay. Paul's saying, don't put your hope in that. Don't put your hope in that which is so uncertain. Paul says, it's not guaranteed to any of us. Don't do it. So Paul continues, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. We hope in God as opposed to hoping or needing our riches. We need God. We want to align ourselves with God. We don't have to put our hope or pursue riches. And our God will richly provide us with everything for our enjoyment. God will richly provide. This does not mean, contrary to what maybe you've heard some pastors say, it does not mean that if you give to God, God will make you rich. The whole point of this message is that we don't need riches. Why would we want God to make us rich if riches isn't what satisfies us in life? Friends, I don't need God to make me rich because my hope is not in riches. We don't need to be afraid of scarcity because less isn't necessarily a loss. I don't have to be desperate for more because more doesn't satisfy. My hope is in God. I want to align myself with God, the kingdom of God that God has invited me into, to live countercultural to the world. While the world pursues and grabs and needs and wants, Jesus says, I have something better for you. And Paul says, hey, church, get this right. I'm commanding you. Don't put your hope in riches, but put your hope in God who richly provides. Whether I have a lot or a little in life, I can flourish. You and I can flourish because God is a firm foundation. And Paul continues in verse 18 with a second command. He says this, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. These people who have extra, this is the flourishing, open-handed life that crushes greed and crushes scarcity. This is the life that God says, I have something better for you. And then he continues in verse 19, and he says this, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. So there is an ownership and a responsibility that we've been entrusted with. Yes, money matters. What we do with it matters. But followers of Jesus are to live a different way of life with it because we have a different hope. It's not that money doesn't matter, so we do whatever we want with it. Money doesn't matter as our hope, so we use money according to what's best for God in our life, and God will richly bless us. Placing our hope in God instead of riches allows us to release the hold that we have on stuff and to be freed from the hold our stuff has on us. And we reject the assumption that if it comes to us, it must be for us. We stop assuming that what we currently have was given to me and for me. And we are unshaken by the turbulence of the world that we live in. And friends, at our church, at all of our campuses, this is why one of our core values here is sacrificial generosity. We believe that Scripture teaches us that generous living leads. It leads us to heavenly riches. And heavenly riches will outlast our temporary lifetime. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend the next 3 weeks talking about what it looks like for us to live generous lives. We're going to ask ourselves how God is calling us to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. We're going to look at this life that is truly life. So what I want to do is I want to challenge you to put this into practice and not just hold on to it in theory. Here's the deal. For the next 2 months, okay? For the next 2 months, for the rest of the series and finishing out this calendar year through December, for the next 2 months, here's what I want you to do. Choose a percentage of your income and give it away as soon as you get paid. This is putting it into practice, not having a philosophical idea about being generous and willing to share, about not building up our worldly wealth, about trusting God in his ways. Choose a percentage of your income and give it away as soon as you get paid. So whether it's your paycheck, bonuses, commissions, tips, paid by the hour, whatever it is, choose a percentage and give it away. And I want you to pick a percentage that you feel that kind of makes you go, oh, right? Somebody might go, okay, I'm going to give 0.5% and I'm going to give it away. No. You won't even feel 0.5%. We waste 0.5% on things all the time. In the Bible uses the word tithe, which literally means 10%. And people ask me, like, why 10%? This is my guess. My guess is because 10% is enough to feel it. Woo-hoo! Well, I'm definitely giving. I'm definitely pointing my resources towards God, but it still leaves 90% to live off of. It's like God knows, hey, I want you to trust me with this, but I'm not taking all of it. You still need to live. You still need to pay the bills. There's still things to do, but this will prioritize your life. But for now, you just pick a percentage that you feel and give it back to God. Be rich toward God. And don't wait to be asked. Decide ahead of time, as soon as I get paid, I'm going to give it away. That's the first part. But the second part is just important. Here's the deal. For the next 2 months, pay attention to the internal tension that this creates, right? Pay attention to this. And also this. How about this? Listen closely to the conversations you have in your mind. When the first thing that you do is pick a percentage and you give it away, and you trust God with it, and you glorify God with it, and you don't hold on to it, for the next 2 months, as you do this, pay attention to the internal tension, the struggle, the rationalizing, the excusing, the fear, what your hope is really in. Pay attention. What's going on in your life? What are you trying to convince yourself of? And where is your heart? Because Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And when you're in this tension, when you're paying close attention to the conversation in your mind, invite Jesus into that tension. Say, Jesus, help me to understand what it is to follow after you, to go your way rather than my way. Friends, I want you to get this right. If I were you, I would want my pastor or one of my pastors calling me forward into this, because we have been entrusted with what we've been given by God. And friends, I have all the questions that you have about the future, right? If you're like, but Brian, if there's already tensions just listening to this, if there's already conversations in your mind, I just want you to know, I have those questions too. I have those tensions too. Here are just some of my questions, okay? How will retirement work? Another question. What about the 25% in my retirement that I've lost this year alone? Here's another question. What about the cost of college for my girls? How will I be able to afford repairs, expensive repairs on my house or on a car? Another question. How can I do something nice for Jen for our 25th anniversary? All of these questions revolve around money, and it revolves around me needing to spend money and my fear or my concern of I need more or I want more. And all of these questions are valid, and I bet your questions are too. But we need to take this tension and this conversation to God so that he can open our hands, so that we can put our trust not in riches, not in all those things working out, but that our hope is in God. He is our firm foundation. And yes, I need to be responsible for all of those questions that I have. I need to make a plan and figure out those things in one way, shape, or form. It's not that we never upgrade. It's not that we don't buy new things. But what do we do first? Where do we place our hope? What do we believe is the life that is truly life? Friends, we can't have a faith compartment and a finance compartment and say that there's life that's truly life and then not live as if it's not true. You and I have been entrusted, dare I say commanded, as followers of Jesus to recognize our role and our responsibility with what has been given to us. And so let's embrace this question. How might this require me to reprioritize where I put my money? Oh, it's not my money. The money that has been entrusted to me. How might this require me to reprioritize where I put the money that has been entrusted to me? The man in the parable, he's like, it's my money, it's my barns, it's mine to hold on to. And Jesus says that's not the right way to think. It's money that has been entrusted to us. And how can we prioritize that in order to follow God and have the heart that God's invited us to have? So in the coming weeks, you'll hear more about how to give and even some exciting plans we have for Christmas giving. It's going to be unbelievably awesome. We'll tell you about that more later. But before we get into all that, this isn't about an offering. This isn't about an initiative. It's about our heart and whether or not we're willing to acknowledge that we've been entrusted to participate, regardless of how much we have or how much we need. Let's be people that respond with a resounding yes to what God has invited us into, a life that is truly life, because everything we have has been entrusted to us by God, and we are accountable for how and for who we leverage it. Let's be the church that God has called us to be. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for sending your Son. You gave us your Son so that we could experience this new life. You were generous towards us and gracious towards us. Lord, help us to reflect that in our own lives. And I pray for every person and every family listening to this message today, with all the questions that they have and all the concerns that they have that are legitimate. But Lord, let us take those concerns and those questions to you. Let us put our hope in you and our trust in you. Show us the way forward, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, everybody. Well, thanks so much for coming. I hope to see you again for church online or at one of our locations at Beaverton Christian, Hope City, or Willamette. We love you guys. We're excited about what God's doing in this future, and we hope to see you again soon.